The monsoon arrives over Mysore in the first week of June, as it has for millennia. The sky darkens to the color of wet stone. Rain comes not as droplets, but as walls of water, drumming against the earth with such force that conversation becomes impossible. In the courtyards of the Mysore Palace, the downpour strikes the granite paving slabs and rebounds upward in a fine mist that smells of dust and mineral. The arches and columns, painted in shades of ivory and rose, darken with moisture. The gold leaf on the domes loses its shine beneath the deluge. For a few minutes, the palace seems almost ordinary, just another structure caught in the cycle of weather, vulnerable and impermanent. But when the rain stops, as it always does, the transformation begins. Water drains through channels carved into the stone a century ago. The sun breaks through the clouds and the palace emerges gleaming, its surfaces reflecting light like a jewel box opened after years in darkness. Visitors arrive by the hundreds, their voices rising in admiration as they pass through the entrance gates. They photograph the arches, the painted ceilings, the stained glass windows that scatter colored light across marble floors. They marvel at the scale, the intricacy, the audacity of the vision. What they do not see, what they cannot see from where they stand, is the infrastructure hidden beneath their feet, the network of pipes and drains, the electrical conduits buried in the walls, the storage rooms filled with replacement parts for chandeliers installed in 1912, the maintenance crews working in basements that smell of old stone and motor oil. Beauty, when achieved at this scale, is never passive. It is not a painting that hangs on a wall, static and complete. It is a living system that demands constant attention, constant resources, constant sacrifice from people whose names are never recorded in the guidebooks. The Mysore Palace, as it stands today, is not ancient. It is not a relic from the age of emperors who commanded armies and controlled trade routes stretching across continents. The building that draws more than 6 million visitors each year was completed in 1912, a product of the early 20th century, an era of electric lighting, reinforced concrete, and global supply chains. It was constructed during a peculiar moment in Indian history when traditional monarchy still existed but operated within the framework of British colonial rule. The Wadeyar dynasty, which had governed Mysore for centuries, retained nominal power, ceremonial authority, and considerable wealth, but their kingdom existed at the pleasure of the British Raj. The palace they built was therefore an act of assertion, a statement rendered in stone and gold leaf that said, "We are still here, we still matter, our culture has not been erased." The man who commissioned this palace, Krishnaraja Wadeyar IV, ascended the throne in 1884 at the age of 10. His childhood was shaped by regents and British advisors who controlled the kingdom's affairs, while the young Maharaja received an education designed to produce a modern, compliant ruler. He studied English literature, Western philosophy, and administrative management. He learned to navigate the complex relationship between his traditional role as a Hindu monarch and the expectations of his colonial overseers. By the time he reached adulthood and assumed real power, he had developed a vision for Mysore that balanced modernization with cultural preservation. He built dams and universities. He invested in factories and infrastructure. He also understood that symbols mattered, that a kingdom's prestige was measured not only in economic output, but in the grandeur of its public face. The old palace, the structure that had housed the Wadeyar family for generations, burned to the ground in 1897. The fire started during a wedding celebration, a spark from a decorative oil lamp catching on fabric. The flames spread with terrifying speed through the wooden structures, consuming centuries of accumulated art, documents, and personal history. By morning, only fragments of the outer walls remained standing. The destruction was total. For some rulers, such a catastrophe might have prompted a retreat, a decision to rebuild modestly or relocate entirely. Krishnaraja Wodeyar IV made a different choice. He would construct a replacement palace that surpassed the original in every dimension, larger, more ornate, more technologically advanced. The new building would demonstrate that the Wodeyar dynasty was not in decline, but entering a new era of prosperity. It would be a monument not to the past, but to the future. He commissioned Henry Irwin, a British architect working in Madras, to design the structure. Irwin had already made a reputation for himself designing colonial government buildings that blended European architectural principles with what the British imagined to be traditional Indian aesthetics. His style was eclectic, drawing on Hindu temple architecture, Islamic domes, Rajput fortifications, and Victorian Gothic ornamentation. The resulting designs produced buildings that were spectacular to look at, but sometimes difficult to live in, structures optimized for visual impact rather than comfort or practicality. The palace Irwin designed for Mysore covered an area of more than 72,000 square feet. It rose to 3 stories in some sections, with towers extending even higher. The central structure was built from gray granite quarried from the hills outside the city, transported by bullock cart and later by rail to the construction site. The facades were finished with fine plaster and painted in soft tones, ivory, rose pink, pale turquoise, that changed hue depending on the angle of the sun. The roofs were covered with domes and turrets, many of them topped with gilded finials that caught the light from miles away. Inside, the palace contained durbar halls capable of accommodating thousands of people during state ceremonies, private quarters for the royal family, offices for administrators, libraries, armories, and storage rooms filled with costumes and ceremonial objects. The largest hall, known as the Kalyana Mandapa, featured a ceiling painted with elaborate murals depicting scenes from Hindu mythology. The floor was laid with polished stone and geometric patterns. Columns rose 20 feet to support arches decorated with carved stucco. At the center of the hall hung a chandelier imported from England, weighing more than 3 tons, composed of thousands of individual glass pieces that refracted light into rainbows across the walls. The construction process consumed 15 years and required the labor of thousands of workers. Stonemasons were brought from Tamil Nadu, specialists in carving granite into intricate shapes. Woodworkers came from Kerala, experts in teak and rosewood joinery. Metalworkers from across South India fabricated the iron gates, brass fittings, and copper gutters. The glaziers who installed the stained glass windows in the Durbar Hall had trained in Europe and returned to India with techniques that few local craftsmen possessed. The logistics of moving materials to the site were staggering. Teak beams, some weighing over a ton, were floated down rivers from forests in the Western Ghats, then transported overland using teams of oxen. Marble for the floors was imported from Rajasthan, a journey that took weeks and involved multiple transfers between rail lines. The colored glass for the windows came from factories in Belgium and England, packed in wooden crates and shipped by sea to Bombay, then transported inland by train. Each shipment represented a financial gamble. Glass broken in transit could not be easily replaced, and delays meant idle workers and mounting costs. Labor was organized in a semi-feudal structure. Master craftsmen contracted with the royal treasury to deliver specific elements of the building: a carved door frame, a section of painted ceiling, a set of brass light fixtures. These masters then hired their own teams of apprentices and laborers, often drawing from family networks and village connections. The workers lived in temporary encampments near the construction site, structures made from bamboo and thatch that housed dozens of men in cramped, unsanitary conditions. They worked from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week. Injuries were common: falls from scaffolding, crushed hands, infections from untreated cuts. There were no labor protections, no insurance schemes, no formal mechanisms for redress if a worker was injured or killed. Families received small payments from the master craftsman, amounts determined by negotiation or charity rather than any legal standard. The palace was designed to impress, and every detail reinforced that objective. The entrance gates were flanked by statues of mythological creatures, their forms rendered in plaster and painted in vivid colors. The main staircase was carved from a single block of granite, each step polished until it reflected light like a mirror. The doors to the Durbar Hall were 12 feet tall, made from teak and covered with silver repoussé panels depicting scenes from the Ramayana. The handles were brass-shaped like lotus buds, but beneath the visible splendor lay systems that required constant management. The palace was one of the first major buildings in India to be fully electrified. Power was generated by a dedicated plant located on the palace grounds, fed by coal brought in by train from mines hundreds of miles away. The electrical wiring ran through conduits embedded in the walls, a labyrinth of copper and insulation that required regular inspection to prevent fires. When the system was first installed, few people in Mysore understood how it worked. Technicians had to be brought from Madras and Bombay to troubleshoot problems. Over time, a small permanent staff of electricians developed the expertise necessary to keep the lights functioning. Water was supplied by a network of underground pipes connected to reservoirs on the outskirts of the city. The system relied on gravity to provide pressure, but during the dry season, when reservoir levels dropped, pumps had to be operated manually to maintain flow. The palace consumed thousands of gallons of water each day, for bathing, cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the gardens. During major ceremonies, when the courtyards were washed down and the fountains activated, consumption spiked even higher. Managing this resource required a dedicated team of plumbers and laborers who monitored the pipes, repaired leaks, and ensured that the supply remained adequate. Heating was not a concern in Mysore's tropical climate, but ventilation was. The thick stone walls and small windows that provided insulation from the heat also trapped stale air. To counteract this, the architects incorporated a system of vents and air shafts that created natural circulation. The effectiveness of this system varied depending on the season and the prevailing winds. During the hottest months, the interior rooms became stifling, and servants were assigned to operate large fans made from cloth stretched over bamboo frames, moving air by hand for hours at a time. The palace officially opened in 1912, though construction continued on certain sections for several more years. The inauguration ceremony drew dignitaries from across India and representatives from the British colonial administration. The Durbar Hall was packed with guests dressed in silk and brocade. The Maharaja, seated on a throne of carved wood inlaid with ivory, received tributes and delivered speeches about the future of Mysore. Outside, thousands of ordinary citizens gathered in the streets, straining for a glimpse of the procession. For them, the palace was a source of pride, a symbol that their city mattered on the national stage. Few understood the financial burden it represented. The construction had cost nearly 42 lakh rupees, an almost incomprehensible sum for the time. To put this in perspective, the annual revenue of the Mysore kingdom was approximately 3 crore rupees. The palace, therefore, consumed more than 10% of the kingdom's entire annual income during the peak years of construction. The money came from multiple sources. Part was drawn from the royal treasury, funds accumulated over generations from taxes, tributes, and trade. Another portion came from loans arranged through British banks, agreements that locked the kingdom into decades of debt servicing. Some materials and labor were provided as a form of tax payment by villages and districts within the kingdom, a traditional practice that converted obligations into contributions. The Maharaja justified the expense by arguing that the palace was not merely a residence, but a tool of governance. It provided a setting where the authority and culture of the kingdom could be displayed to subjects and foreign visitors alike. It hosted ceremonies that reinforced social hierarchies and religious traditions. It served as an administrative center where policies were discussed and decisions made. In this sense, the palace was an investment in the kingdom's political stability and international reputation. But investments, by definition, must generate returns, and the returns from a palace are difficult to measure. The building did not produce goods for export or generate tax revenue directly. Its value was symbolic and intangible, residing in the realm of prestige and morale. Over the following decades, as economic pressures mounted and political conditions shifted, those intangible benefits became harder to justify. The daily operation of the palace required a staff of hundreds. There were cooks and cleaners, guards and gardeners, secretaries and accountants. There were specialists responsible for maintaining the chandeliers, others who polished the silver, still others who cared for the horses and elephants kept for ceremonial purposes. Each role was essential, and each demanded payment. The payroll consumed a significant portion of the kingdom's budget every month. The cooks worked in kitchens located in a separate wing of the palace, rooms filled with wood-fired stoves and copper pots large enough to prepare meals for hundreds. The menu varied depending on the occasion, ranging from simple vegetarian dishes for daily consumption to elaborate multi-course feasts during festivals. Ingredients were sourced from across the region: rice from the Kaveri Delta, spices from the coastal markets, vegetables from farms on the outskirts of the city. Managing this supply chain required coordination and constant vigilance to prevent spoilage or shortages. The cleaning staff worked in shifts, ensuring that the palace remained spotless despite the constant flow of foot traffic. Marble floors were washed with water and scrubbed with stiff brushes. Dust was removed from the intricate carvings using soft cloths and careful hands. The stained glass windows were cleaned with vinegar and polished until they gleamed. This work was invisible when done well, noticed only when neglected. The guards patrolled the grounds day and night, a necessary precaution in a building filled with valuable objects and important people. They carried staffs and wore uniforms that marked them as representatives of royal authority. Their presence was both practical and symbolic, a reminder that the palace was not a public space open to all but a controlled environment where access was granted by privilege or permission. The gardeners maintained the grounds surrounding the palace, an expanse of lawns, flower beds, and ornamental trees. The gardens were designed in the English style, with manicured hedges and geometric paths, a deliberate contrast to the traditional Mughal gardens that emphasized water and symmetry. Maintaining this landscape required irrigation systems, fertilizers, and constant pruning. During the monsoon, growth was so rapid that the gardeners worked every day to prevent the grounds from becoming overgrown. During the dry season, they hauled water by hand to keep the plants alive. The financial fragility of this operation became apparent during the First World War. Global trade routes were disrupted, and the cost of imported goods skyrocketed. The price of coal necessary to run the palace's electrical generator tripled. The supply of spare parts for machinery became unreliable, forcing the maintenance staff to improvise repairs. The British colonial administration imposed new taxes to fund the war effort, reducing the revenue available to the Mysore kingdom. At the same time, traditional sources of income, land taxes from rural districts, declined as agricultural productivity suffered from erratic weather and labor shortages. Krishnaraja Wadiyar IV responded by instituting a series of cost-cutting measures. Staff positions were eliminated through attrition, with vacancies left unfilled when workers retired or resigned. Ceremonial events were scaled back, reducing the need for expensive displays. Some sections of the palace were closed off to reduce cleaning and maintenance costs. The electrical generator was run only during the evening hours, and candles were used during the day in rooms where natural light was insufficient. These measures stabilized the finances in the short term, but initiated a slow process of decline. Systems that required regular maintenance began to deteriorate. The drainage channels in the courtyards, which had been cleaned monthly, were now cleaned only once or twice a year. During heavy rains, water pooled on the marble floors, seeping into cracks and causing structural damage. The electrical wiring, which had been inspected quarterly, went years without attention. Small faults accumulated, increasing the risk of fires. The Maharaja himself was a man of contradictions. Contemporary accounts describe him as deeply religious, spending hours each day in prayer and meditation. He was also a modernizer who embraced technology and science, installing one of the first telephones in Mysore and taking an active interest in the kingdom's industrial development. He read widely in multiple languages, maintained correspondence with intellectuals and politicians across India, and grappled with the question of how to preserve cultural traditions in an era of rapid change. His relationship with the palace was complex. He understood that it was both an asset and a liability, a source of pride and a drain on resources. He valued the craftsmanship and beauty it represented, but resented the financial constraints it imposed. In private letters, he expressed frustration at the constant demands for repairs and maintenance, the endless stream of problems that required his attention and his money. Yet he never seriously considered abandoning the palace or selling it off. To do so would have been to admit failure, to signal that the dynasty could no longer sustain the symbols of its own authority. The economic pressures intensified during the 1920s and 30s. The Great Depression rippled through global markets, reducing demand for Indian exports and driving down commodity prices. The Mysore kingdom's revenue from silk production, one of its major industries, collapsed. The British colonial administration, facing its own financial difficulties, demanded higher tribute payments from the princely states. The kingdom was caught in a vice, squeezed from above by colonial obligations and from below by declining productivity. In response, the Maharaja began selling off assets. Land holdings on the outskirts of the city were auctioned to private buyers. Art and artifacts from the royal collection were quietly sold through dealers in Bombay and London. These sales generated cash, but represented a permanent loss of resources. Each transaction diminished the kingdom's wealth and its ability to sustain itself in the future. The palace itself became a target of criticism. Political activists, inspired by the growing independence movement, questioned the legitimacy of maintaining such an opulent structure, while ordinary people struggled with poverty. Pamphlets circulated in the city accusing the Maharaja of wasting public funds on personal vanity. Some called for the palace to be converted into a hospital or a school, institutions that would serve the public rather than a single family. The Maharaja defended the palace in public statements, arguing that it was a cultural heritage site that belonged to all the people of Mysore, not just the royal family. He pointed out that the building employed hundreds of workers whose livelihoods depended on its continued operation. He emphasized the palace's role in attracting visitors and generating economic activity in the city. These arguments had merit, but they also revealed the fundamental tension at the heart of the project. The palace was simultaneously a private residence and a public monument, and those two functions were increasingly difficult to reconcile. The Second World War brought new challenges. The British administration diverted resources to the war effort, imposing rationing and price controls that affected everything from fuel to food. The palace's electrical generator, already running on a reduced schedule, was further curtailed to conserve coal. Maintenance work was postponed indefinitely. Sections of the building that had been merely neglected now fell into disrepair. Rainwater leaked through damaged roofs, staining the painted ceilings and warping the wooden floors beneath. In 1947, India gained independence from British rule. The transition was chaotic and violent, marked by communal riots and mass migrations. The princely states, including Mysore, were given a choice: accede to the new Indian Union or attempt to maintain independence. Krishnaraja Wodeyar IV, who had died in 1940, did not live to see this moment. His nephew and successor, Jayachamarajendra Wodeyar, faced the decision. After negotiations with the Indian government, he agreed to accede, effectively ending the kingdom's sovereignty. The integration of Mysore into the Indian Union had profound implications for the palace. The royal family retained ownership of the building, but lost much of the revenue that had sustained it. The new government imposed taxes on the property and eliminated the traditional tributes and levies that had filled the royal treasury. The family was forced to fund the palace's operation from personal wealth, which, while substantial, was finite. Jayachamarajendra Wodeyar was an intellectual, a philosopher who had studied at Oxford and developed an interest in Western classical music. He was less interested in the ceremonial aspects of royalty than his predecessors had been. He viewed the palace not as a symbol of power, but as a responsibility, a cultural artifact that required preservation. Under his stewardship, efforts were made to catalog the palace's contents, document its architecture, and begin a program of systematic restoration. But preservation requires money, and money was increasingly scarce. The family could not afford to maintain the full staff that had once kept the palace running smoothly. The number of servants was reduced dramatically from hundreds to a few dozen. Those who remained were older workers with decades of experience, men and women who had spent their entire lives in service to the palace. They continued their work not because the pay was good, it was barely adequate, but because they had nowhere else to go and no other identity. The palace's financial model shifted from royal patronage to tourism. In 1953, sections of the building were opened to the public for the first time, with visitors paying a small entrance fee to tour the Durbar halls and view the art collection. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of people arrived each week, drawn by the opportunity to see inside a world that had been closed to them for centuries. The entrance fees generated revenue, though nowhere near enough to cover the full cost of operation and maintenance. Tourism brought new problems. The influx of visitors caused wear and tear on the floors and furnishings. The marble, which had survived decades with minimal damage, began to show scratches and stains from the constant traffic. The air inside the palace, once relatively clean, became thick with dust stirred up by thousands of footsteps. The staff struggled to clean the building adequately while it remained open to the public during the day. Security became a concern. With so many people moving through the palace, it was impossible to monitor everyone closely. Theft became a recurring issue. Small objects, decorative items, pieces of fabric, even fragments of carved wood disappeared. Guards were hired to patrol the public areas, but they were too few to prevent all losses. Some artifacts were moved to locked storage, reducing the richness of the visitor experience, but protecting the most valuable pieces. The 1960s and 70s were a period of gradual deterioration. The family lacked the resources to undertake major restoration projects, and the government, preoccupied with nation-building and economic development, provided little support. The palace became a symbol of faded glory, a relic of a bygone era that survived through inertia rather than active stewardship. In 1971, the Indian government abolished the privy purses that had provided financial support to the former royal families. This policy, intended to promote equality and reduce the privileges of the old elite, had the unintended consequence of destabilizing the institutions those families had maintained. For the Mysore Palace, it meant the loss of a critical source of funding. The family was forced to seek alternative revenue streams. The solution was commercialization. The palace grounds were rented out for events, weddings, corporate functions, cultural festivals. The Durbar Hall, which had hosted coronations and state ceremonies, now hosted fashion shows and product launches. These events generated income, but they also changed the character of the space. The palace was no longer a site of historical and cultural significance alone. It was also a venue for hire, its meaning shaped by whoever could afford to pay. At the same time, the government of Karnataka, the state in which Mysore is located, began to take a more active role in the palace's management. Recognizing its value as a tourist attraction and a piece of cultural heritage, the state provided funding for restoration projects and infrastructure improvements. A new electrical system was installed, replacing the aging generator with a connection to the municipal power grid. The drainage system was overhauled, preventing the flooding that had damaged the courtyards. The exterior walls were repainted, restoring their original colors. These improvements stabilized the palace and allowed it to continue functioning as a tourist destination. Annual visitor numbers climbed into the millions, making the palace one of India's most visited heritage sites. The entrance fees, combined with revenue from events and government grants, created a more sustainable financial model. But sustainability is not the same as abundance. The palace still operates on a tight budget, with every major expenditure requiring careful planning and negotiation. The people who work at the palace today are a mix of old and new. A few elderly staff members remain from the era when the building was still a royal residence, living repositories of knowledge about the palace's routines and quirks. They remember when the Durbar Hall was used for actual governance, when the Maharaja held court and made decisions that affected the lives of millions. They remember the smell of incense during religious ceremonies, the sound of traditional music echoing through the corridors, the weight of history pressing down on every interaction. The newer staff members are hired through government agencies and private contractors. They are younger, often from villages and towns outside Mysore, drawn to the city by the promise of stable employment. They undergo training in heritage conservation and customer service, learning to balance the demands of preservation with the realities of mass tourism. They speak multiple languages to accommodate visitors from around the world. They answer the same questions hundreds of times a day with patience and professionalism. The conservationists who oversee the palace's restoration work are a specialized group, trained in techniques for preserving old materials without damaging them. They analyze the chemical composition of paints to match colors accurately. They test the structural integrity of wooden beams and stone columns. They consult historical records to understand how the palace was originally constructed and identify the most appropriate methods for repair. One of their most challenging projects involved the restoration of the stained glass windows in the Durbar Hall. The glass, installed more than a century ago, had deteriorated due to exposure to heat and humidity. Some panels had cracked, others had lost their color. The conservationists had to source replacement glass that matched the original in composition and appearance, a process that required collaboration with specialized manufacturers in Europe. Each panel was carefully removed, repaired, or replaced and reinstalled. The work took years and cost millions of rupees, but it preserved one of the palace's most distinctive features. The financial reality of modern heritage conservation is that it never ends. Every repair reveals new problems. Every solution is temporary. The palace will always require attention, always demand resources. The question is not whether to invest, but how much and from what sources. Tourism provides the bulk of the revenue, but tourism is volatile. Political instability, economic downturns, and public health crises can reduce visitor numbers overnight. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the palace was closed to the public for months. Revenue vanished, but the costs of maintenance did not. Staff had to be retained, security continued, and essential repairs could not be postponed. The palace survived this period through emergency government funding and loans, adding to its long-term financial obligations. The palace's relationship with the city of Mysore has also evolved. Once a symbol of royal authority, it is now a cornerstone of the local economy. Hotels, restaurants, and shops cluster around the palace, catering to the millions of tourists who visit each year. The city's infrastructure, roads, public transportation, utilities, has been shaped by the need to accommodate these visitors. The palace is no longer just a building, but the center of a vast economic ecosystem. Yet, this dependence creates vulnerabilities. If the palace were to close or decline, the economic impact on the city would be severe. Thousands of jobs would be lost, not just within the palace itself, but in the surrounding businesses. The government, therefore, has a strong incentive to keep the palace operational, but that incentive is financial rather than cultural. The palace is valued for the revenue it generates, not necessarily for the history it represents. This instrumental view of heritage is not unique to Mysore. Across India and around the world, historic sites are increasingly evaluated based on their economic utility. They are expected to justify their existence through ticket sales, job creation, and tourism spending. The preservation of beauty and culture becomes secondary to the preservation of economic value. This shift has practical benefits. It provides funding and political support for conservation, but it also changes the nature of the sites themselves. They become products to be marketed rather than places to be understood. The Mysore Palace has adapted to this reality with varying degrees of success. The evening illumination, when the palace is lit up with thousands of bulbs, is one of the most popular tourist attractions in the region. Visitors gather in the streets to watch the building glow against the night sky, their cameras and phones capturing images that will be shared on social media around the world. The illumination is spectacular, a display of light and architecture that justifies the price of admission. It is also expensive, consuming enormous amounts of electricity and requiring constant maintenance to replace burnt-out bulbs and repair wiring. The palace hosts a sound and light show that narrates the history of the Wodeyar dynasty using recorded voices, music, and projected images to bring the past to life. The show is designed to be accessible to audiences with limited knowledge of Indian history, simplifying complex events into a coherent narrative. It is effective as entertainment, but less so as education, reducing centuries of political, cultural, and social change into a series of dramatic highlights. These commercial ventures generate revenue, but they also raise questions about authenticity and integrity. Is the palace being preserved as it was, or is it being transformed into something new, a hybrid of museum, entertainment venue, and event space? The answer is both. Preservation always involves change, because the context in which a building exists is always changing. The challenge is to manage that change in a way that respects the past while acknowledging the needs of the present. The people who make decisions about the palace's future are a diverse group. Government officials from the Department of Archaeology and Museums have formal authority over many aspects of the site. They set policies on restoration, visitor access, and commercial use. They negotiate with contractors and allocate budgets. Their decisions are shaped by political considerations, budget constraints, and bureaucratic procedures. The descendants of the Wodeyar family retain symbolic authority and continue to live in parts of the palace complex. They participate in ceremonial events and advocate for the preservation of the building's cultural significance. They do not have formal power over the palace's management, but exert influence through their status and connections. Conservationists and historians provide expertise and guidance, arguing for approaches that prioritize long-term preservation over short-term gains. They push back against commercial pressures that might compromise the integrity of the site. They document changes and advocate for best practices based on international standards. Ordinary citizens of Mysore and visitors from around the world also have a stake in the palace's future. Their engagement, expressed through tourism, donations, and public advocacy, shapes the broader context in which decisions are made. When a controversial proposal is made, such as allowing a film crew to shoot inside the Durbar Hall or hosting a large concert on the grounds, public opinion can influence the outcome. The palace is, in this sense, not owned by any single entity but held in trust by a complex network of stakeholders. This arrangement has advantages. It prevents unilateral decisions that might harm the site, but it also creates gridlock, making it difficult to implement bold changes or take risks. One of the ongoing debates concerns accessibility. Should the palace prioritize the experience of visitors or the preservation of the building? Allowing more people inside generates more revenue but also accelerates wear and tear. Limiting access protects the site but reduces its economic and social impact. There is no perfect balance, only trade-offs that must be continually reassessed. Another debate concerns authenticity. When a section of the palace needs to be repaired, should it be restored to its original condition using traditional materials and techniques, even if that is more expensive and time-consuming? Or should modern materials and methods be used to achieve a similar appearance at lower cost? The first approach respects historical integrity, but may not be financially sustainable. The second is pragmatic, but risks creating a pastiche, a building that looks old but is fundamentally different from what it once was. These debates reflect deeper questions about the value of heritage and the purpose of preservation. Is the goal to maintain a physical artifact in as close to its original state as possible, or to sustain a living tradition that evolves over time? Is the palace a museum, a monument, or a continuing expression of cultural identity? The answer, in practice, is all of the above. The palace functions in multiple registers simultaneously. It is a tourist attraction that provides employment and revenue. It is a historical site that offers insight into the past. It is a symbol of regional pride and cultural continuity. It is a work of art that embodies aesthetic values and human creativity. These functions sometimes align and sometimes conflict, and managing those conflicts is the essence of the work required to keep the palace alive. The labor involved in this work is immense and largely invisible. The conservators who spend months analyzing a single painted ceiling, the electricians who crawl through narrow conduits to replace wiring, the cleaners who arrive before dawn to prepare the palace for the day's visitors, the guards who stand for hours in the heat, ensuring that no one touches the fragile artifacts, the administrators who write grant proposals, negotiate contracts, and balance budgets. Each contributes a piece of the effort required to sustain the illusion that the palace is permanent and unchanging. The financial cost is easier to quantify, but no less daunting. The palace's annual operating budget runs into the tens of millions of rupees. This covers salaries, utilities, routine maintenance, security, and administrative expenses. Major restoration projects cost far more and must be funded through special grants or loans. The state government provides some support, but it is never enough to cover all the needs. The palace relies on a patchwork of funding sources, each with its own conditions and constraints. The emotional cost is harder to measure, but equally real. The stress of managing a deteriorating building with inadequate resources, the frustration of seeing necessary work postponed for lack of funds, the anxiety of balancing commercial pressures with the responsibility to preserve cultural heritage. The sadness of watching a place you love slowly decline despite your best efforts. Yet the palace endures. It endures not because it is invincible, but because people continue to care for it. It endures because decisions are made year after year to invest time, money, and effort in its survival. It endures because its beauty and significance inspire enough people to ensure that it does not simply fade away. The story of the Mysore Palace is not a story of triumph. It is not a tale of visionaries who created something perfect that has remained unchanged for a century. It is a story of survival through adaptation, of compromise and sacrifice, of the gap between aspiration and reality. It is a story about the price of beauty and the hidden systems that sustain it. The laborers who built the palace worked in conditions of hardship and danger. Many were injured, some died, and none received recognition for their contributions. The craftsmen who created the carvings and paintings poured their skill into the work, but their names were not recorded. The servants who maintained the palace lived in obscurity, their labor taken for granted. The financial burden of construction and operation fell on the kingdom's subjects, who paid taxes and provided tributes, whether they benefited from the palace or not. The palace has survived into the present day because the meaning of survival changed. What began as a royal residence became a public heritage site. What was once sustained by feudal extraction is now funded by tourism and government grants. The systems that keep the palace functioning today are different from those that built it, but they still rely on labor, money, and sacrifice. The question posed at the beginning, who truly paid for this dream and what does it cost to keep it alive, has a straightforward answer and a complex one. The straightforward answer is that the laborers, craftsmen, and subjects of the Mysore kingdom paid for the palace with their work, their resources, and sometimes their lives. The complex answer is that payment is not a one-time transaction, but an ongoing process. The palace continues to be paid for by the people who work there, the taxpayers who fund its preservation, the visitors who buy tickets, and the citizens of Mysore whose city is shaped by its presence. The cost is measured not only in money, but in the compromises required to sustain it. The decision to commercialize the space, the acceptance of wear and tear from millions of visitors, the slow erosion of authenticity as original materials are replaced with modern substitutes, the constant negotiation between preservation and accessibility, between historical integrity and economic necessity. These compromises are not failures. They are the means by which the palace has been able to persist in a world that no longer values monarchy or respects the privileges of hereditary elites. The palace has adapted because the people who care for it understand that perfect preservation is impossible, that survival requires flexibility and pragmatism. In the end, the Mysore Palace stands as a testament not to the power of kings, but to the dedication of ordinary people. It exists because conservators analyze and repair, because cleaners scrub and polish, because electricians maintain and troubleshoot, because administrators negotiate and plan, because visitors pay entrance fees and governments allocate budgets, because enough people believe that the palace is worth the effort. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It endures only through continuous effort, compromise, and service. The palace is not a miracle of eternal grandeur, but a fragile achievement maintained by human hands, season after season, year after year, generation after generation. Its survival is not guaranteed. It depends on decisions yet to be made, resources yet to be secured, labor yet to be performed. The rain will come again next June, as it always does. The palace will darken and gleam. Visitors will marvel at its beauty, photographing the arches and the domes and the light filtering through stained glass. Most will not think about the pipes that carry away the rainwater, the workers who repair the leaks. the budget discussions that determine whether a damaged ceiling will be restored or left to deteriorate further. They will see the facade and not the system that sustains it. But the system is the story. The hidden labor, the impossible finances, the constant struggle to preserve something beautiful in a world that does not make preservation easy. This is what the palace represents. Not a monument to the past, but a living example of what it takes to keep beauty alive. If beauty requires continuous sacrifice to survive, and that sacrifice is borne unequally, do we have a moral obligation to change how we preserve it, or does the value of what endures justify the cost?